What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. It's week 8 of the fantasy football season, and my gosh, there is a ton of buys in the NFL. People are calling it buy-mageddon. People are calling it the buy-apocalypse. Whatever you're calling it, there's lots of stuff to navigate here this week, not even including the injuries that are here on the slate. So today, what we're going to be talking about is my top 36 wide receivers heading into week 8 of the fantasy football season. Still lots of information to know, but I do want to get you guys these rankings as soon as possible. So with that being said, I don't want to waste too much more time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. All right, so as you can see, I got the tier maker pulled up on the screen. I got 7 tiers to get through all 36 wide receivers here in today's video. As always, the label that you see on the left side of the tier is how I'm viewing these players if you are plugging them into your fantasy football lineup. So the guys at the top are going to be the elite wide receiver 1 plays, and the guys down at the bottom are more so those low-end wide receiver 3s. So let's just kick it off in the first tier. The first tier for me has 2 players. It's going to be Ja'Marr Chase, and it's going to be Rashee Rice here as the 1 and 2. There's not too much to say. Ja'Marr Chase, ever since Joe Flacco has got here, has been peppered with targets, and Rashee Rice came back into action, scores 2 touchdowns, looks like Mahomes' favorite target again. There's not too much, like I said, to say about these guys. These guys are going to be very, very fine plays here this week. Let's go to tier number 2. Tier number 2 is those high-end wide receiver ones. I got 4 guys. It's CeeDee Lamb at 3, Justin Jefferson at 4, Courtland Sutton at 5, and I got Drake London here at 6. Lots of matchups to focus on here in this tier. CeeDee is on the road at Denver. Denver is a very bad matchup against the wide receiver position. Currently the number 1 team, allowing the least amount of fantasy points per game to that group at just 18.4 fantasy points per game. So a tougher matchup for CeeDee Lamb, but CeeDee Lamb is CeeDee Lamb. He is a little bit more matchup proof than I think some of these other guys here in the slate, just in general, as you get into some of the lower tiers. Justin Jefferson, kind of the same thing can be said for him. He's on the road to the Los Angeles Chargers. It's Thursday night football. Los Angeles is the 5th best against wide receivers, only allowing 22.8 fantasy points per game. Like I said with CeeDee Lamb, though, a little bit less dependent on matchups, and I think he's just a great play no matter what. So Courtland Sutton is a player that I do like the matchup for in this tier as my number 5 guy. He gets to play the Dallas Cowboys, and the Dallas Cowboys are currently ranked dead last against the wide receiver position going into this week. Giving up 35.4 fantasy points per game should be a great spot for Courtland Sutton to score plenty of points here this weekend, and I'm expecting some big things. Drake London gets a tough matchup as well. It's Miami. Miami is currently the 6th best against wide receivers, and I think that's because teams just run all over Miami. So we'll see what happens with Drake London, but still a great play. Obviously peppered with targets with Michael Penix here. You know, you got the splits with Mooney in and out of the lineup. We'll see how that shakes out the rest of the year, but I do like Drake London still as a high-end wide receiver 1. Going on to my tier 3, I got 6 players in this tier, starting with Chris Olave at 7. I got AJ Brown at 8. 9 is Odunze. 10 is Emeka Egbuka. 11 is Zay Flowers, and 12 is DK Metcalf. Now, this is the entire tier for me. Some good matchups in this tier to focus on. I think the ones that are the best are AJ Brown, who gets to play against the New York Giants. That matchup right now is 30th against the wide receiver position, giving up 33.4 fantasy points per game. So AJ Brown kind of had a decent week last week. Obviously, we saw the passing increase there in Philadelphia. Should be another opportunity to stack that here in this week's matchup against the Giants. Baltimore is another good matchup. That's who Odunze is facing right now. They are currently ranked 28th in the NFL against the wide receiver position, giving up 33 fantasy points per game. So you could have Caleb Williams and Odunze throwing some deep balls here in this matchup, potentially exploiting that Baltimore Ravens secondary. And the only other player I'll really mention in this tier is Emeka Egbuka. Obviously, you know, playing through the hamstring injury last week didn't really work out for him. Kind of disappointed some fantasy football managers, but Mike Evans goes down. It's going to be right back to Emeka Egbuka as the wide receiver 1, so still like him to play. He's probable going into the week. I don't expect him to be held out of this matchup. Like I said, the hamstring, you know, it's a lingering thing a little bit, but should have plenty of opportunity on the table, and we're not going to look at him as anything less than this low-end wide receiver 1 here in week 8. Let's go to tier 4. Tier 4 is those high-end wide receiver 2s. I got a total of 5 guys in this tier. It's going to be Michael Pittman Jr., Nico Collins, Lad McConkey, Devonta Smith, and I got Teteroa McMillan in this tier as well. Nico Collins is battling an injury right now. Obviously, he has a concussion. That is going to be TBD on whether or not that holds him out this week, but I didn't want to leave him off the list if he does play, just because it's a concussion. More so it's just kind of passing protocol and not necessarily something that is a physical thing that could impact his play. I do think it's a player that if he plays, I'm going to be viewing him as my wide receiver 14 in this high-end wide receiver 2 tier, because the matchup against San Francisco isn't good or bad. bad. It's just a normal matchup for him on paper. Let's go to the Thursday night game. Like I said, Ladd McConkey plays the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings are the 8th best against the wide receiver position, so a little bit of a tougher matchup here for these Los Angeles Chargers receivers. Ladd McConkey is my favorite of the group still. I do think he is definitely a player that I would be looking at as a high-end wide receiver too, despite the tougher matchup. And I do think Devonta Smith, the same thing we said about A.J. Brown, where the New York Giants are ranked 30th against the wide receiver position, it should apply to Devonta as well. So if they keep throwing the football around just to make these guys happy, it's a little bit of the squeaky wheel gets the oil. I think that's kind of what's happening here with these Philadelphia wide receivers. So we're seeing A.J. Brown and Devonta get a little bit more involved because there was some complaints in the locker room and maybe on social media and some other things with these guys, but it's working out well. So definitely viewing him as a high-end wide receiver too. Let's go to tier 5. Tier 5 is my largest tier of the entire video today. I think it's 8 players total in this tier, and these are the low-end wide receiver 2s. I'm going to start it with Stephon Diggs, followed by T. Higgins, Keenan Allen, Xavier Worthy, Jalen Waddle, George Pickens, Jordan Addison, and then DJ Moore to round out that entire tier for me. We can talk about plenty of matchups here as well. Keenan Allen, echoing the same things that we said with Ladd McConkey, 8th best against the wide receiver position, a little bit tougher on paper. Still like Keenan Allen in this one, despite it obviously coming in as a top 20 play for me this week. I do think we get a bad matchup for Jalen Waddle, who goes on the road to play in Atlanta. Atlanta is the 2nd best against the wide receiver group so far, and obviously Tua Tagovailoa has not played good football so far this year. So I do think that Jalen Waddle is a player that is probably not going to have the highest of ceilings this week in a tough matchup with the way that Tua has played. It's another bad matchup as well for George Pickens. We talked about that with CeeDee Lamb. I said CeeDee Lamb was matchup proof. I think George Pickens is somewhat matchup proof because the offense has to throw the football around so much here, especially as they're going to be on the road here in Denver. I think George Pickens is going to be a little bit more boom bust than he has been in the start of the year because now CeeDee Lamb is back into the lineup and Jake Ferguson is still involved in this team. So I do think he's going to be a little bit more boom bust. It's not because I dislike him, but I do think some of the number 1 targets that he was getting as the first read in this offense are now going to go back to CeeDee Lamb. Now, Jordan Addison gets a tough matchup as well. We talked about that one with Justin Jefferson. Like I said, Thursday night on the road at the Los Angeles Chargers. They are top 5 against the wide receiver position. Jordan Addison has been really good since coming back from suspension. 15 fantasy points per game or better in every single game. He's had a couple 100-yard games, a couple touchdowns. Just feels like a player that is definitely still going to be involved in this offense. And with Carson Wentz still under center, you're expecting them to kind of get that hectic throw around the yard, play this keep up game sometimes with Carson Wentz. It hasn't been great football from Minnesota, but it's equaled fantasy points for Jordan Addison, so I'm not really complaining too much there. The last player I want to talk about is DJ Moore, and we talked about it with Rome Odunze. It's a good matchup. They play Baltimore. Baltimore, has been weak against the wide receiver position. DJ has definitely taken a backseat to Rome Odunze so far this year, but I do think he is a fine low-end wide receiver 2, maybe more of a high-end wide receiver 3, probably the low-end wide receiver 2, though, this week in this matchup against Baltimore. Now, tier 6 is going to be those high-end wide receiver 3s. I do have a total of 5 players in this tier. It's going to be Wan'Dale Robinson, Quentin Johnston, Khalil Shakir, Romeo Doubs, and I got Troy Franklin in this tier as well. I think Quentin Johnston is an interesting player to talk about in this tier because, like I said, it's a bad matchup for those Chargers receivers, but also he's kind of been coming back from this hamstring injury. It did seem like it kind of has limited him just a little bit, but I don't think he's a player that is necessarily going to be a bad play. Obviously, you still have him as a top 27. Maybe that's also just due to the bye weeks that we have this week. Maybe he'd be more of a low-end wide receiver 3 if we had some other players in the slate. But I kind of want to see him get back into full health and see if he's going to be, one of the biggest contributors in this offense. Started off great for him, obviously, with the touchdowns. Touchdowns can regress. We'll see what happens. Right now, I have this wide receiver room ranked Ladd McConkey, Keenan Allen, and Quentin Johnston in that order this week. You get a bad matchup on paper for Khalil Shakir as well, who comes in as my wide receiver 28. They're on the road against the Carolina Panthers. Carolina is top 4 against wide receivers so far this season, only allowing 22.2 fantasy points per game. So could be an interesting game for Khalil Shakir. He doesn't necessarily always see the number 1 cornerback coverage, which has been J.C. Horn. J.C. Horn's been playing some really good football this year, so we'll see what happens in this game. Still think he's a high-end wide receiver 3, and mainly that's because he doesn't have a massive ceiling in this offense. He just doesn't have those boom weeks, but he has a very safe floor. The same thing can be said for Romeo Doubs, who gets a good matchup this week. He plays the 29th ranked Pittsburgh Steelers defense, who is currently allowing 33.2 fantasy points per game to that wide receiver group. I think he has emerged as the number 1 target kind of number one target. Maybe Tucker Kraft is the number one target in this offense with Jaden Reed off of the football field. So Romeo Doubs, he's the Green Bay Packers wide receiver that I'm the most comfortable playing this week, and I think he has some touchdown upside as well in this offense, but still for me a wide receiver 3 play. Troy Franklin is an interesting play for me because he plays the Dallas Cowboys, who, like I said, are dead last. Obviously, I very much like Courtland Sutton in this week's slate. I think Troy Franklin is the number 2 wide receiver in this offense. Certainly the targets have said that over the last couple of weeks, and I think if you were looking for a pickup and play wide receiver off of the waiver wire this week, Troy Franklin is one of my favorite guys to do so. In fact, I picked him up in my home league, and I am going to be playing him this week as my wide receiver 4, I think, in my flex spot. So I do like Troy Franklin as a pickup and play option. Obviously, the matchup has been very, very fruitful for wide receivers who have faced the Dallas Cowboys, so I do like this for Troy Franklin this week, and he's a high-end wide receiver 3. And now my final tier here, the low-end wide receiver 3s to round out my top 36. I do have Rashee Shaheed, Matthew Golden, Juwan Jennings, Josh Downs, Kendrick Bourne, and Marvin Mims at 36. So let's talk about pretty much everybody here. I'm going to start with Matthew Golden. It's a good matchup on paper. He hasn't given us the boom week that we've wanted out of him so far, but this could be a good opportunity. Like I said, Pittsburgh is 29th against the wide receiver position, so should be an opportunity for him to exploit maybe an easier matchup. Although that being said, you know, you say the data 29th against the wide receiver position, it does feel like Joey Porter, Slay, and Jalen Ramsey should be a tougher matchup than that, but the data is the data, so sometimes you got to just look at the data and take away the names from who they're facing. But it does feel like there's still room for, you know, Matthew Golden to grow as a wide receiver right now. Juwan Jennings gets a tough matchup on the road at Houston. Houston is the 7th best against the wide receiver position right now, only allowing 23.2 fantasy points per game. I think Jennings is an interesting player because he's kind of been battling through injury all year round, and I don't know, you know, if he's going to get fully healthy as long as he keeps playing through it. Still would be playing him though. We'll see what happens with Brock Purdy's status. Josh Downs is another player who's interesting in this tier, but he has a concussion. So if he can pass concussion protocol, you know, he's a player that I'd still be looking at as a wide receiver 3 play potentially. A bad matchup for Kendrick Bourne as well. Didn't have the week last week that we've been accustomed to for Kendrick, but just like Juwan Jennings, as long as there's injuries here in this San Francisco offense with Ricky Pearsall and some of these other guys, I think we can still keep relying on Kendrick Bourne as this desperation wide receiver 3 who has shown us some PPR upside before. And lastly, Marvin Mims, like I said, great matchup against Dallas, should be an opportunity for a couple of big plays. Marvin Mims is the big play guy in this offense, so maybe he can catch a deep ball, maybe 2 of them, one of them goes for a long touchdown. I don't know. You see the vision here with Marvin Mims. Definitely an interesting play this week. If you're looking for waiver wire pickups, like I said, I think Mims is a waiver wire guy you can pick up and play in your lineup. But all right, folks, there you have it. That is my top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 8 of the fantasy football season. Lots of buys, lots of injuries to navigate, like I said, but as always, if you did find something today informative, entertaining, actionable, do me the favor, hit the like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel. You don't want to miss any of the future content. And last but not least, make sure you are a member of the free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with those fantasy football teams 24/7, 365. But with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today. So I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.